A new level of ambition and excellence thrives at the Texas Tech System. A $2 billion higher education enterprise with 4 diverse and distinguished universities. Because from here, it's possible.
I am neither Emily Bazelon nor Eric Holder, but I am Evan Smith, the CEO of the Text Tribune. You having a good time? Yeah. I seem to remember this festival used to be someplace not downtown, but kind of forgotten. This new footprint has worked out so great. We think, I hope you all agree, we've had a great time today. You've all had fun? Good. Good. Very quickly, I want to say welcome and thank you. I know that most of you have been here for portions of the day already and gotten to enjoy great content, and hopefully you'll stick with us for the balance of the day and also be back here tomorrow. Please know the Texas Tribune is as serious as can be about putting as many Texans as possible into a conversation about the priorities of our state. 28.3 million people, every single decision made at the Capitol here and the Capitol in Washington affects all 28.3 million, and most people in this state have not made that connect. Our job is to give you the means to be better citizens through public service journalism. It is that simple. And so we're doing this festival for the 8th straight year, in part because we want to welcome you into a conversation that we hope does not end when this weekend ends, but it continues in your hands. So by being here, you're saying that you support the idea that Texas can be better by being more informed and more engaged. That is what this is about, so thank you. This session is presented by our friends at HNK Strategies. We are so fortunate to have wonderful individuals, foundations, and corporate sponsors pay for journalism that holds people in power and institutions accountable. That is a great thing. We need to do that. They support us, and all of you who are members of the Texas Tribune support us as well. If you're a member, thank you. If you're not a member, please consider becoming one. This weekend, if you give a gift of $35 or more as a member, we enter you in a drawing to win a weekend in Marfa. Stay at El Cosmico, eat at Cochineal, text Tribune to 444-999 as the screen said, or go to texastribune.org/Marfa2018. Please welcome, and we are so lucky to have them, Emily Bazelon and Attorney General Eric Holder.
You can bring any
This isn't
materials
fair.
you want. I won't have like quiz you.
She can't have this stuff.
Pick up.
Well, good. Oh.
Hi, it is such a pleasure to be here with all of you and with General Holder.
Hey there.
So great to be here with you. You really need no introduction, but I will give you one anyway.
Say some nice things about me anyway.
Some nice things. Eric Holder is the 82nd Attorney General of the United States. He served in that role for the first 6 years of Barack Obama's presidential administration. A different time than the one we are in now.
Yeah, don't you miss him now?
He is currently the chairman of the National Democratic Redistricting Commission, which he will tell us more about. He's also a partner at the law firm Covington and Burling, a former prosecutor. He was the chief prosecutor in Washington, D.C. in the 1990s. And we're so glad to be here with you today. I'm going to read you or tell you a few instructions. So we're going to be here for an hour together. We'll take questions for 15 to 20 minutes at the end. And the way the Q&A here works is that you submit questions by texting to AskTrib, A-S-K-T-R-I-B, or you can tweet at us, not actually at us, but you can tweet at the festival using the hashtag, #AskTrib. And so then Trib reporters are standing by. They will collect the questions and read them. And I'm also supposed to remind you to silence your phones, so please do that. Okay.
All right.
This is an amazing day for me to get to talk to you and for all of us to get to hear some of your thoughts.
Yeah, there have been some things going on.
There are some things going on. They involve Washington, D.C. Of course, the Supreme Court nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh, the dramatic hearing yesterday in which Christine Blasey Ford laid out her accusations against him of sexual assault. And now today we have another wrinkle in the story where Senator Jeff Flake, now joined by Joe Manchin and Lisa Murkowski of West Virginia and Alaska, are calling for an FBI investigation, a renewed background check of Kavanaugh. They're calling for that before the final confirmation vote. So you used to be in charge of the FBI. What's going to happen next, and what do you think about this process?
Well, first off, I mean, holding an additional FBI background check is something they should have done like a week or two ago. I mean, you know, it's not, these are not things that happen too frequently, but they're not unusual either. Any number of times during the Obama years, and I understand during the Trump years as well, some problems develop, so you send out the FBI, they send out some leads, as they are called, and agents from around the country, there are 90-something FBI field offices, will then follow up, do interviews, and then send a report back. This is kind of routine, and the notion that they were going to try to put somebody on the Supreme Court without having some kind of interaction with people who had information about allegations that are as serious as they are, and that certainly I didn't get to see the testimony live, but I saw a lot of the clips of it later, to have a person who was as credible, at least to me, as Dr. Ford was, to not examine that, to try to, first off, rush this thing through, to not share 90% of his documents, then not deal with these allegations by having the FBI go out, was something that I thought was unconscionable. And so what they've done now is only that which they should have done before.
Right, that's really interesting. So what do you think the breadth of this investigation should be? We have these, as you say, and I think actually there was really a consensus that Dr. Ford was a very credible witness for herself. We also have these other allegations from Deborah Ramirez and Julia Swetnick. Those witnesses were not heard from. They haven't testified publicly, but those accusations are swirling out there, and they involve Kavanaugh's conduct in high school, but also in college. Right. So should the FBI be looking into all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think you put yourself in a position where you're pre-nomination, and if you'd heard these allegations, you certainly would have the FBI go out and investigate them. It seems to me that just because we are at a different time in the process doesn't negate the fact that there should still be this FBI look into these allegations. We are, after all, talking about somebody who will be on the Supreme Court potentially for 30, 40 years. Now, I have thoughts about that. I think they shouldn't serve more than 18 years, but that's one thing.
I am with you on that
one. But, you know, the FBI can knock this off in probably a week, you know, something along those lines. This isn't going to create some unbelievably long delay. And if Kavanaugh is as strong as he says he is in his denials, well, I would want to be the person who was, in essence, exonerated by the FBI as opposed to going on the court with a cloud over my head.
What did you think of Mark Judge's absence from the hearing yesterday? He's the person Ford is named as being in the room, Blasey Ford, I should say. He says that he stands by Kavanaugh's account, but obviously he also has written extensively about his own alcoholism and blackouts at that period in his life. Did you feel like we need to hear from him?
Oh, I think we certainly needed to hear from him. I remember the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings, where you had an FBI investigation. You had, I think, about 20 witnesses or so. It seemed to me that that is a good way to have done it. President Bush ordered the investigation. I think President Trump should do the same here. Judge should certainly be questioned under oath by the committee, and let's see what he has to say. Now, I've heard that he has indicated some degree of lack of knowledge, whatever. Now, I've only heard this. I don't know, is that something from him, or is this a letter from his lawyers that we're hearing from? I don't know what the state of.
Well,
what I think what we do need to do is hear from him.
Yes, And I think one interesting thing yesterday was that he had submitted a letter from his lawyer, and Judge Kavanaugh actually claimed it was a sworn statement from Judge, which was not the case. It was one of several misrepresentations in yesterday's testimony. And I wonder, thinking about this from the point of view of a law enforcement official, if that in itself is reason to want to do more investigating here.
Yeah, I actually found his testimony, again, I did not see all of it. I only saw, pretty extensive clips of it, but some of the things that I saw were a little troubling.
The audience is with you, I think.
Okay, well, I mean, just from a credibility standpoint, saying certain things about things that I think everybody kind of assumes to be not right. I mean, minor things, not necessarily minor, but not necessarily going to the heart of the interaction with Dr. Ford, but the way in which he characterized his drinking, not blacking out. I mean, all these kinds of things, which everyone seems to say that, well, he was a guy who did a lot of drinking and, maybe did things when he was drinking. And that kind of screed at the beginning where he talked about this is pent-up emotion around the Trump election, and then something about the Clintons. And I was thinking, well, what is, what is
payback for the Clintons.
Payback from the Clintons. And I'm thinking, where's that coming from? There are little things that, again, as if I'm a prosecutor trying to assess, the credibility of this witness, there were things that would have given me pause.
It seemed very tribal to me, that moment, and I keep thinking that Kavanaugh had a choice a few weeks ago. He could have gone down a path of, I did a lot of drinking in high school, I don't remember everything, I'm so sorry if I hurt someone, I'm a changed man. And George W. Bush, as you all know, that was a very powerful redemption narrative that the American people went for. But he didn't go in that direction, and it seems that by closing off that path, he's left himself in a corner, I think, in terms of denying everything in a way that then raises the kinds of questions you were talking about.
Well, I think it gives you a couple of options. One, either what he's saying is in fact the truth, or, I guess as Rick Wilson wrote the book, everything that Trump touches dies, and it might be that he is taking, because I remember reading one report that emphasized that Trump was saying he didn't like the interview on Fox and this guy needed to be more strident, more forceful, and he certainly got that in the hearing yesterday. How'd that work out for you, And so I can't, that would have been in some ways the thing you would have expected to hear, high school kid, drank too much, made mistakes, I'm a different person, but he didn't decide to go that way.
Right, exactly. And now we're at this point where there are these misrepresentations on the record, small and in some cases medium-sized or even large. What do you think about that in terms of Kavanaugh's role as a judge and his potential role as a Supreme Court justice?
We see, I think that's really important because we now have two things we have to examine, or two sets of things. There are these questions about his interactions with these women some time ago, and those, I think, by themselves could be disqualifying. But we also have to look at what is it that he said during the course of his testimony. And did he, in fact, testify falsely, lie to the committee? Either of those buckets, I think, could lead to, from my perspective, the disqualification of him as a viable Supreme Court nominee. But I think there are actually two things that have to be examined.
And when you think of the standard for disqualifying him, what kind of standard are you using now? We're not in a courtroom. He's not going to jail. I would imagine, at least in my view, beyond a reasonable doubt is not the right standard. But do you have an alternate one in your mind? There is no rule about how the Senate should be assessing that question.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I wouldn't say beyond a reasonable doubt. I'm not sure I would say, more likely than not. Clear and convincing evidence, which is kind of somewhere in between. I think that's probably what I would look. That's kind of the standard that I think I would use.
Okay, I'm going to switch gears. I bet the audience may have more questions for you about Judge Kavanaugh. I want to hear about the work of the National Democratic Redistricting Commission. Redistricting, it's very clear in Texas, is incredibly important to the composition of our government. It's also a really wonky topic that I think is in my view, is starting to permeate the public consciousness. I feel like when I try to write about it now, my editors don't look at me like I'm crazy in quite the same, to quite the same degree. And I wonder how you decided to address the issues of voting rights and representation through this particular lens.
Well, I mean, President Obama and I were sitting down and talking about what we were going to do in our post-government lives. First, get some sleep. And then from there, move on to what is it that we wanted to focus on. And I think that what we both kind of independently came to the same place and made the determination that a gridlocked, gerrymandered Congress had prevented him from doing a lot of things that he wanted to do. Now, I think history is going to be very kind, I think, to Barack Obama, but I think there are still things that he could have done that we might have been able to get through legislation as opposed to executive order, executive action. And so we decided, let's focus on gerrymandering, and that necessarily means that takes you into the states. And so we put together the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, and I decided that I wanted to accept the offer to head it up, and so that's what I've been doing since January of 2017.
So one thing that's interesting about addressing gerrymandering is it's not necessarily the same as trying to increase the influence of Democrats, right? I mean, the end goal can be more proportional representation, and that nationally probably would benefit Democrats, but what you're really talking about is a fairer, more even-handed process state by state. Right. So states like Maryland, for example, that gerrymander in favor of Democrats would also be affected.
Yeah.
How do you get people excited about a kind of good government change that is not partisan?
Well, first off, I mean, I want to emphasize that. The NDRC is not a body that is trying to gerrymander for Democrats. All I want to do is make sure that the redistricting process that happens in 2021, we have to do it every 10 years after the census in 2020, which also has to be fair, that we have a fair process. And if we make this a fair battle after the redistricting, between Republicans, conservatives, Democrats, progressives and progressives will do just fine in a fair fight. So we need to make sure that these structures that we have in place are in fact fair. But the thing I think the way we have to break through is that, it does sound kind of wonky and kind of political. What does that mean? Well, people need to understand that gerrymandering has an impact on their day-to-day lives, whether it is with regard to reproductive decisions that women have the ability to make, gun laws, voter suppression, climate change, the expansion of health care. All of these things are connected to who's actually making these decisions in state capitals and in Congress. And in too many instances, the representatives in Congress and in state capitals are voting for things that are inconsistent with what their constituents want to have happen. But because of gerrymandering, you don't have to worry about an electoral consequence. You only have to worry about being challenged in a primary, which pushes people further and further to the right. And to be fair, sometimes further and further to the left.
It's polarizing. Polarizing,
yeah. It leads to gridlock, polarization, which then leads to voter cynicism and people not participating in the system.
Right, less competitive elections too. So what are the strategies you see as most promising? Last term, the Supreme Court essentially backed away from allowing lower federal courts to use the federal Constitution to monitor gerrymandering, to stop extreme gerrymanders like the one right now in Wisconsin or Maryland. Yeah. What avenues do you see as being open and most promising?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't totally given up on the federal courts. The North Carolina case is winding its way back up to the Supreme Court on kind of an accelerated basis, and I think the standing question will be dealt with. But with Justice Kennedy gone, I'm not sure that we can hope that the Supreme Court's going to come up with some kind of really consequential ruling there. So I think on the litigation side, we still have the ability to go after gerrymandering from a racial perspective. We can still use what remains of the Voting Rights Act, and we have filed lawsuits there. But I think something that's promising is to use the state constitutions as a way to get at the problem of gerrymandering. One of the cases that we supported was what happened in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court, looking at the Pennsylvania Constitution, ruled that gerrymandering there was unconstitutional. And so we are going to be supporting cases like that. I know my staff is there getting a little nervous. We're going to be announcing some lawsuits soon that follow that path. In addition, we are supporting independent commissions where I think we should take it out of the hands of politicians altogether and just have commissions that are nonpartisan be the ones who actually draw the lines. That happens in California, happens in Arizona now. We're supporting similar efforts in Michigan, Colorado, Utah, and Missouri. We think that I think that's actually the best way to do it. And then we are supporting candidates who will stand for a fair redistricting process. And that typically means that we are supporting Democratic candidates who are trying to take power away from Republicans who I will say got it illegitimately as a result of the redistricting that was done in 2011.
And then the idea would be if you have candidates in office who are in the legislature, which clearly in most states has the power to redistrict, then those people would be directly responsible and held accountable for those promises.
Right. Governors always matter, state legislators always matter, but in certain states, people down ballot matter as well. In Ohio, for instance, the state auditor matters a great deal. The state secretary of state in Ohio matters a great deal. Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Supreme Court plays an outsized influence. So we have 12 target states, and we're focused on those people within those states, those positions within those states that can have an impact on the redistricting process in 2021. And Texas is one of our target states.
Anything in particular to Texas that you want to share with the audience?
Well, we have moved $250,000 to elect more Democrats to the Texas House. And I think that is just the first tranche of money that we'll be doing. I just did an event with a number of the candidates who are running for the House here in Texas, and so we want to try to, over couple of cycles, get to a position where we have greater representation of Democrats in the House, in the Senate as well. It was only 10 years ago, I guess 2008, that the House in Texas had a 2-seat differential between Republicans, had 2 more seats than Democrats. We now have 40 more Republicans than Democrats, and that's as a result of the redistricting that happened in 2011 and then the elections in 2012 and subsequently. So, it's not that long ago that this state was a lot more in tune with what I think really reflects the people and the desires of the people in this state. The legislature that we now have in Texas, I don't think represents the will of the people.
One of the things that I love about redistricting conversations is we start talking about people like the Secretary of State and the state auditor, who normally we don't talk about as much as we should. It also strikes me that your focus is on down ballot races, which Democrats in the past have been, I think, guilty of neglecting to a certain degree. Is that sort of a side benefit of this project and focus?
I wouldn't even say it's a side benefit as much as it's a primary objective. People, I think you're right, Democrats have gotten, and President Obama talks about this, you see Obama in 2012, you see Obama in 2008, and everybody gets charged up and goes to the polls. Well, in 2010, 2014, we don't have Obama at the head of the ticket, and we're talking about so-called down ballot races, a phrase that I don't like because it implies that they're not as important. And the reality is that on a day-to-day basis, people who are down ballot probably have a greater impact on the lives of American citizens. Yeah.
Up ballot?
Up ballot, or turn the ballot around, or something. Put the presidential candidate at the bottom or something. Yeah. I don't know. But we're focusing on these so-called down ballot races because they're important to redistricting, but also because in terms of our civic life, we need to be focused on the people who are on our school boards, people who are in our city council, people who are mayors, county commissioners. These are people who are deciding things that, as I said, on a day-to-day basis have an impact on our lives, our children's lives, and we need to be focusing attention and getting involved in those races. And Democrats certainly need to do that to a greater degree than we have in the recent past.
How did you choose the 12 states? I'm asking partly because I bet where I live, Connecticut is not on your list, but one thing I've noticed is that, not that it should be, but that blue states are not as good on access to voting and having just being models in this area as they should be anyway.
Yeah, New York, for instance, I'm born and raised in New York City. New York is an awful state when it comes to access to voting. There really is just basically one day that you can come in and vote. There's no early voting and all that kind of stuff. And so there need to be changes there. New York was actually on our watch list for other reasons, and it no longer is. But we chose our states on the basis, we did a 50-state analysis, and then try to determine, given the resources, limited resources that we were going to be able to, that we were going to have, to focus on those places where we think we could have the greatest bang for the buck. The Brennan Center identified, I think, 6 or 7 states that accounted for pretty substantial, I don't know, 60, 70% of all of the gerrymandering in the country. So those automatically got on the list. And then there were other places that had systems that we thought were actually pretty good, but that needed to be protected. And so they got on the list. And so we end up with, like, you know, I guess Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida, Texas, Nevada, forgetting a couple. But I mean,
that was a lot. You got a lot in there.
Yeah, so, but there's 12. You can go onto our website, you can find out the ones that I
there are
might
like
have
2
missed,
or 3.
you know.
I want to ask you a little bit about your record as Attorney General. You were running a Justice Department with a different set of priorities than the current Justice Department. I do think. I feel like I know that.
We paid attention to the notion of justice, you know, Department of Justice.
So when you were running the Department of Justice, as you think back, what are the accomplishments that you are the proudest of?
Ooh, that's like asking me which of my kids do I like the most. And on any given day, I could answer that question. But I mean, I think you know, the work that we did in protecting voting rights, the advancement of LGBTQ rights, and the decision not to defend the Defense of Marriage Act.
Yeah, that was a big thing.
The decision to push terrorism cases into the Article 3 courts as opposed to the military tribunals. I guess those are the kinds of things that I think, you know, I think I'm most proud of. And criminal justice reform. I think those are things that I think we did. I think we made some progress that I anticipated would be carried on by Hillary Clinton's Attorney General. Didn't work out that way.
I'm going to add one thing to your list. You issued a memo about charging in particularly nonviolent drug cases in which you were giving U.S. attorneys' offices, federal prosecutors around the country, the freedom not to charge the maximum possible charge, which can make a huge difference because the charging that prosecutors do kind of sets the baseline often. That is a memo that Attorney General Sessions has reversed. And I wonder, well, I mean, I suppose that you don't think that was the best decision that he made.
That's pretty damn stupid.
And why do you put it that way?
Well, because, you know, what I said was in the memo that I issued in 2010, which reversed the John Ashcroft memo, the department unfortunately kind of gets whipsawed, it seems here. Their view was that you look at a particular case and you just charge the maximum penalty that you can. And what I said was, you know, I trust the assistant U.S. attorneys who serve in the Justice Department. I said, look at each individual. Look at the individual who is in front of you and determine what is justice in this case. If justice means that this is a person who's a first-time offender, but who was, we call them mules in a drug case, and had on his or her person a really, you know, substantial amount of drugs, but did so in a nonviolent way, was strictly a courier. The federal guidelines might say that you ought to charge this in such a way that this person would face a 20, 30-year sentence. But is that really justice? Is that really what this system should be doing to this individual? And so we pulled the shackles off and said, we said we had guidelines, but within those guidelines, I'm going to trust the men and women of the department to do the right thing in individualized cases. And that being the case, I thought we would get to a more fair system. You know, people say, well, the guidelines are there, and those things would ensure that justice was done. And if, you know, the Federal Sentencing Commission did a study that compared African-American defendants in the federal system with their white counterparts, similar backgrounds, similar crimes. Black defendants were serving sentences that were 20% longer. And so it seemed to me we needed to do something more. And charging decisions by prosecutors really kind of set the table. And so I was just giving more discretion to our prosecutors to, you know, make appropriate determinations in individualized cases.
And when you look back at your time as Attorney General, are there things you would do differently now? And I guess I wonder in particular about white-collar, big bank prosecutions, a critique of the left that after the financial crisis, the financial institutions that were responsible for it in some ways were not criminally prosecuted.
All right, now if you want to get me upset, you throw that one at me. because you start with this baseline. You know, we got record fines from those banks who were involved in the mortgage-backed security things. And we took those fines and didn't put the money into the federal treasury. We charged them in such a way that we could take the money and then shoot the money back out to organizations that were helping people who had problems with their mortgages, or straight to people who were dealing with these mortgage issues. I have letters on my desk at my law firm from people who said, you know, thank you for helping me with my mortgage. So you did that. We also did prosecute certain numbers of individuals and certain companies, but not to the degree that people certainly wanted us to do. And all I can say about that is that, you know, we made the cases that we could. We tried to make other cases against large institutions and against more high-ranking people within those institutions. But, you know, there are standards that we have to meet. You have to have the ability to say that going into a case, it's more likely than not that we're going to be successful. You then have to go into a court and then, beyond a reasonable doubt, prove those cases. And we simply were unable to make the cases. Now, you know, I'd like to, and people need to understand also that these are career-making cases. And if assistant U.S. attorneys in the Southern District of New York, Preet Bharara, the U.S. attorney there, or, you know, other people around the country who were assigned these matters, if they could have made those cases, they would have. These are, as I said, career-defining cases for people who are in the department. So it wasn't from lack of effort that we were unable to make these cases, but we didn't make them to the degree I think that people wanted us to.
Is the legal standard the right one? Should it be easier to prosecute people at the top of the food chain?
Yeah, I actually think that's a point. I guess just as I was leaving, I gave a speech at NYU, and I talked about how the standards are too high with regard to some of the statutes that we can employ. And I think I said also that there is the need to, in some ways, galvanize people who have inside information, give them rewards in the way that we do with the False Claims Act. If you report a fraud against the federal government, you get a percentage of the recovery that the federal government gets. And I thought we should incentivize whistleblowers within financial institutions in the same way. And that, I thought, would develop information that we didn't have as we were trying to make those high-level cases in the Obama administration.
So one more topic before we turn to questions. I'm super interested in a new movement that's building to elect a different kind of prosecutor. Right. DAs who come into office, they're promising to reduce mass incarceration rather than add to it. They're promising greater fairness. You all have some of these folks getting elected in Texas, and it's happening in big metropolitan areas and even small rural areas around the country. You were a chief prosecutor in the 90s, a different time. You were interested in smart on crime, I think, when you were in the Justice Department. Right. These folks are taking it, I would argue, a kind of step further in a reflection of the fact that crime is down, that mass incarceration has gotten so high that there are concerns all across the political spectrum about its cost, the human toll and the actual financial cost. I wonder if you're watching this movement and what you think about it.
I think it's great. I mean, I think it's absolutely great. And I think that people need to understand the importance of those elections. This is another one of those down ballot races, you know? Who's going to be the DA? Who's going to be the county prosecutor? These are people who will set policies in place for offices that have the ability to take liberty away from, you know, your fellow citizens. They set prosecution priorities that has an impact on how the police interact with the citizens that they are supposed to serve. And so I think that putting more progressive people in charge of DA's offices, prosecutors' offices, is a good thing. And is consistent with what I tried to do when I was the U.S. Attorney in Washington, D.C., and when I was the Attorney General of the United States. I mean, in some ways, you have to think of it this way. Who do you want to be your DA, Eric Holder or Jeff Sessions? I mean, it really comes down to, you know, it really comes down to those kinds of questions, because there are people who have fundamentally different views of what a prosecutor should do, what a prosecutor's office should look like, what police departments should be doing, and to have this new wave of young men and women who have the view that our justice system should be fair, should be perceived as fair, and that there's not a tension between criminal justice reform and keeping people safe. You see, that's something we have to understand. that you can have all these reform movements and still keep people safe. In the Obama administration, one statistic I always love to quote is that for the first time in 40 years, we saw a reduction in crime at the same time that we saw a reduction in the federal prison population. It had not happened for 40 years as we were rolling out these reform measures. And that can happen at the state and local level as well.
The district attorney in Harris County, Houston and its environs, Kim Ogg, has a way that I find really compelling of talking about public safety and the role of the prosecutor. And what she says about it is that actually you make people more safe, because when people trust law enforcement, when they feel like the police are solving crimes, they're more likely to come and help them and be witnesses and participate in the system.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, you have to think about this systemically. When I was a judge on the D.C. Superior Court in Washington, D.C., I would see cases where the prosecution had proven its case not beyond a reasonable doubt, but to a moral certainty, a drug case, and they'd end up with a hung jury.
Sure.
I used to always talk to the jurors afterwards, and I say, respectfully, so why didn't you all convict you? And it would be like 11-1, 10-2, for conviction. And these jurors would say, I know what cops do, I know what prosecutors do, and I wasn't going to send another black man to jail for 15, 20, I know what the sentences are. I'm not going to send another black man to jail for 15, 20 years, given the nature of this case. I know, and think about that, I know what cops do, I know what prosecutors do. If you break down those barriers, you'd have jurors who would vote on the basis of the evidence as opposed to what they perceive to be unfairness in those parts of the law enforcement establishment. You'd also have people, as you just said, who would come forward. A crime has occurred, you're trying to find leads, you're trying to find people to share information. If those people believe in, have a relationship with the law enforcement community, they're much more likely to share information, and you end up solving crimes.
Let's see, I'm trying to decide whether to ask you one more question before I turn to the
Only if it's an easy one.
Only if it's an easy one. Are you interested in running for president of the United States?
I said only if it's an easy one.
It's like a yes or no question.
Okay. Well, it's not a yes or no answer. And I've said this publicly before. This is something that I'm thinking about, and I'm going to decide by the first quarter of next year. But my focus really now is on November the 6th and making sure that I feel better on November the 7th than I did 18 months ago. People have to understand there is going to be a blue wave. There's no question about that. But that blue wave is going to run into a wall of gerrymandering. And the question is, will it get to the shore? In Virginia last year, Democrats beat Republicans by 10 points, and were unable to take over the General Assembly in Virginia as a result of gerrymandering. And I'm really concerned that unless we have a huge turnout around the country, that blue wall will not overcome, that the blue wave will not overcome that gerrymandering wall. So between now and November the 6th, I'm going to be all over the country doing as much as I can to convince people to get out there and vote.
And how optimistic, or how are you feeling? I know that's sort of a crazy question, or it's early still, but I wonder if you're traveling around, what kind of sense you're getting.
I feel pretty good. It's interesting because as you get away from Washington, D.C., people are aware of, but not as focused on the Russia investigation as we are in D.C. People are concerned about healthcare, about education, about economic issues. And I think Democrats have good answers to those problems, and I think we have seen Republican failures in that regard. So I'm actually pretty optimistic, but I'm also cautious. Everybody thought there was a blue wall and there was no way that Hillary would not get to 270 electoral votes.
Yes, they did think that.
And so I look at polls now, and I have great respect for pollsters, but I'm like, yeah, good, that's good, I'm still working, and I'll sleep on November the 7th. Between now and then, we got to work.
Do you think that Democrats need to be running on policy on the kinds of pocketbook, day-to-day life issues, as opposed to Washington, corruption? And maybe the answer is both and, but I wonder sometimes if the Mueller investigation, even though it's critical, is confusing to people and that they need another way to feel that their vote is important.
No, I think you should do both. I mean, we ought to focus on those issues that, as I said, people have indicated to me are of concern. You know, the expansion of Medicaid, for instance, here in this state. Other health care related issues, protecting Obamacare, education, you know, the plight of teachers and how they have been treated, don't get the necessary tools, not the respect, the salaries that they deserve. So we focus on all of those issues, while at the same time pointing out, and I'm just going to say it, you know, how corrupt this administration has been, how complicit this Congress has been in protecting that administration, and how people at the state and local levels have signed up for the Trump agenda. And so I think that people are capable of hearing these dual messages, taking them in, processing them, and that I think will be good for Democrats. This is all, you know, factually based stuff. When I say corrupt, I mean, this is an administration the likes of which we have not seen, I don't know, maybe ever, but certainly not in the recent past. And to have people at the state and local level who fashion themselves as Trump acolytes, and if you're serving in Congress, you know, at the state level, you're serving in Congress in the House of Representatives or in the Senate, and you're not doing any kind of oversight. I mean, imagine if an Obama cabinet member had done the things that Scott Pruitt had done. Think about how many oversight hearings we would have had, or Price, you know, the guy at HHS, how many oversight hearings we would have had. We've had nothing out of this Congress, absolutely zero. So yeah, we need to talk about that. We need to talk about folks at the state level who are supporting them, but we also need to talk about those pocketbook issues. That's a dual message that I think all Democrats should be taking to the people whose votes they are seeking.
All right, I think we're ready for some audience questions, and we have some audience questions.
Yeah, we have a lot of audience questions.
Whoa.
So many. Our first one is, do FBI background investigations normally look at people's lives during their high school years? And do you think that may explain why information on Cavanaugh's high school time was not looked at in the initial background check?
Well, it's interesting. I went through a couple of background checks, and they changed over time. They used to ask you a drug question. Have you ever used marijuana? And then at one point it was, have you, from the age of 18 on, have you ever used marijuana? And then I guess the third iteration I heard of it was, since you got out of law school, have you ever, you know. So there was that. But there's always a catch-all question at the end where they ask you, is there anything that you have done in your life that you think is disqualifying or would be embarrassing to the president / administration? And that is, that's a question that I think would encompass the things that are going to now be examined. You know, it's interesting because in my last background check, when I was being, I guess, interviewed by the folks within the campaign as they were considering me for Attorney General, you go through all these questions, and then everybody leaves, and then it was just me and one guy, and it happened to be Don Varelli, who then became the Solicitor General. And so they ask you a series of, you know, like really personal questions, I mean, really personal questions, among which was they asked me, have you ever owned racehorses?
That's so funny. Sorry.
And I was thinking, what?
What?
And Don just said, hey, it's on the list. I got to ask. So these are, I'm saying that to say that both at the administration level and at the FBI, these are really probing kinds of things, and this is the kind of information that would have been elicited from the candidate, a Supreme Court candidate.
Have you owned racehorses? You didn't actually.
No.
And if you had, then what? Sorry.
No, but I've been to the horse races, and I've picked a couple of winners. More losers.
This one comes from Neil D., who asks, do you think that Cavanaugh displayed extreme partisanship during his hearings? And if so, that he would have to recuse himself from certain cases, for example, redistricting cases?
It was interesting. I actually thought, you know, you talked about the way in which he could have described what happened. You know, young man, drank too much, I'm a different person. What I saw yesterday, especially in that opening statement, revealed him in a way that I think he had not been revealed in his initial testimony, and he seemed more the political operative to me than a judge on the D.C. Court of Appeals, and that was kind of jarring for me. I didn't quite expect to see that. And I think there are some legitimate questions that could be raised, and I think that's another consideration that senators should weigh. There, on the basis of what he said and the way in which he conducted himself yesterday, I think litigants could actually say, you know, with all due respect, Mr. Justice, we think that you should recuse yourself from, you know, from this case based on what you said during your confirmation hearings.
This one comes from Dr. Jennifer Merseca. Why do Americans perceive that crime is high or increasing when it's not, but don't recognize the real widespread violence against women as a crime?
Well, because, you know, crime is used or has been used as a wedge issue. Remember this notion of American carnage during Trump's inaugural address?
Yes.
Jeff Sessions, you know, talks about violence as if, you know, we're not safe in this auditorium on a minute-by-minute basis. These are wedge issues that they use to drive a policy agenda without focusing on the real things that we ought to be focusing on, which is, you know, things like violence against women, crimes that we see in distressed communities. You know, there are pockets of crime, pockets of violence that we need to address. It is not nearly as widespread as Trump and Sessions would have you believe. You know, the crime rate has been coming down pretty steadily since about the mid-90s. There was the slightest uptick in the 2 years before this one that Sessions kind of grabbed onto and said, look, see, crime, it's on the rise. We have to do make all these policy changes. Well, you know, this year crime again has gone down. And so I think they use this for political purposes and to stoke their base. And so that means they're focused on things that move a base without focusing on things that ought to be their concern.
Can I add just an interesting little factoid? So it is true that people exaggerate the crime rate broadly, but in their own communities, they tend not to do that. And I think that's one of the reasons there is room for these local elected district attorneys who have more progressive politics, is that when people are talking about their own community, they seem to have a clearer sense of what's happening.
Yeah.
This one is from Dana Morales. The final outcome in Holder v. Shelby, I think it was actually Shelby v. Holder, was such a disappointment. Could you discuss the consequences of the revocation of the Voting Rights Act's pre-clearance requirement?
Yeah, I hate the fact that my name is on that case. You know, I mean, and everybody within the Justice Department knew that we didn't call it Shelby County v. Holder, it was just called Shelby County. Because I just, you know, that's like having your name attached to the Dred Scott opinion or something.
So you were on the side of pushing back.
Yeah, I was on the side of pushing back, but, you know, whenever that case is mentioned, my name is there. And it's a terrible decision. By taking the pre-clearance authority away from the Justice Department, we saw, just as Justice Ginsburg predicted, that these state legislatures just went straight to town and put in place all of these voter suppression laws, all based on the notion of preventing in-person voter fraud, which the Brennan Center has said is more likely to occur. You're more likely to be hit by lightning than to cast an in-person fraudulent ballot. And so all the things that you know, Justice Ginsburg said were going to happen have in fact happened. In Georgia, when they were going to close 7 of 9 polling places in a largely African-American area in the state that had been used in the primaries. And they said, we need to close them because they weren't compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. We used them 3 months before. We just happen to have a black woman who's running for governor in Georgia. Nothing to do with that, nothing to do with that. That's something that if they had tried to do in a pre-clearance era, the Justice Department would have said, no, you can't do that. Now, any public pressure forced them to not do what they were intending to do. But that is a concrete example of removing a tool from the Justice Department that would have kept the nation you know, more fair.
This one comes from Louise. Texas is getting rid of straight ticket voting next year. How do you think that will affect votes in Texas and other states that have made that change?
You know, I don't quite understand. Yeah, I think it's a negative thing. To the extent that you want to cast a party line vote, you should have that option. Okay, if you don't want to do that, you know it's forced to vote only for Republicans or only for Democrats. But if that's what you want to do, I think you ought to be entitled to do that. But what I would urge citizens to do, if that is your intention, and if they mean you have to push a whole bunch of buttons instead of just one, push all of those buttons. These state legislatures assume that we're dumber than we are. It was like, okay, so I can't vote straight party line using one mechanism. Well, I'll vote straight party line using more than one. Maybe it's going to mean I'm going to be in the polling place a little longer. Maybe it means the lines are going to be a little longer. But people have, if we come out in huge numbers, if we are conversant with the machines that we're going to have to deal with, if we are familiar with the issues, we can overcome a lot of these unnecessary state laws. But that just goes to show you how far they'll go to try to reduce the possibility that Republicans will give up their power. They can do everything they possibly can to hold on to power that, as I said before, after the 2011 redistricting, they illegitimately obtained.
This comes from Nancy Mossman. What can be done to ensure a fairly executed census process that counts everyone?
Well, I think we have to keep our eyes on good old Wilbur Ross and Jeff Sessions, Donald Trump, the people who are responsible for this. The NDRC has filed a lawsuit against the census inclusion of the citizenship question. There's not been included on the census long form this question of whether or not you are a citizen since 1950. Sessions says that he needs that question so that he can enforce the Voting Rights Act. Now, if you look up in the dictionary, open it up, and you look up the word hypocrisy, you will see a picture of Jeff Sessions. That is the most hypocritical thing. The inclusion of that question is really designed to suppress the count in immigrant communities, in Hispanic communities. And so we have filed a lawsuit there. Texas is one of we've got plaintiffs from 5 states. One of them is resident here in Texas. One is from Arizona, who is Cesar Chavez's grandson. And I think we actually have a pretty good shot at winning that case. But states can also be involved in the census process. This is a federal responsibility, but state and localities can also be involved in it. And so I would urge people to make sure that you're making sure that your state officials, be they at the state level or at the local level, are also doing all that they can to ensure that there is a legitimate count.
This one comes from Jimmy Cunahan. You mentioned a conversation with President Obama about life post-White House that suggests that the two of you have a good relationship. How does the relationship between President and Attorney General affect the AG's performance?
That's actually a very interesting question, and it really is, in this sense, that President Obama and I, we've not known each other, forever, but I got to know him, I guess, after he had been elected as a senator, before he got sworn in. That's when I met him, and we just kind of hit it off. He likes Chicago sports, I like New York sports, and so through that mutual disagreement, we became close. I never convinced him about the Knicks, and he'll never convince me about the Bulls. But we became close. But we understood, though, that when I became Attorney General, our relationship had to change, that there were certain things that we could not talk about, that I had to be independent in ways that would be different. We talk about everything during the campaign, and when I was going to his office when he was a senator, we talk about a whole variety of things. But there were certain things I could not share with him when he became president and I was Attorney General. And it was a certain artificiality that came to our relationship, and that's the way I think it should be. Now, going the other way, I didn't have to put up with a president who was constantly calling on me to resign, constantly, denigrating my performance. And that has a negative impact on obviously the Attorney General, I guess personally, but also on the morale of people in the Justice Department who are going to do their jobs, regardless of where the morale level is. But I think that's going to have, on the margins, it's going to have some impact on their performance. And so the relationship between the President and the Attorney General is complicated. I remember when Pat Leahy was head of the Judiciary Committee, when I was going for my pre-confirmation interview with him, he said, "You're not going to be the Secretary of Justice. You're going to be the Attorney General of the United States. You're different from other cabinet members. You have to be independent. Do you understand that? And that always resonated with me, that notion of not Secretary of Justice, yes, you're the Attorney General of the United States.
Jade Vasquez asks, could you have done more as Attorney General to address police brutality, particularly the fatal shootings of unarmed black men? And what should the DOJ do now to ensure police accountability?
Yeah. You know, there are always things that you look back on and you think, you know, could I have done more? And that's one of those issues. It's a heartbreaking thing to see unarmed black men shot, you know, driving, walking in their apartments, and as a black man who is cognizant of the history of my people in this country, it's a constant reminder of, although we're in a fundamentally different nation, we're still not yet at the place where we need to be. And I think back, you know, to could I have done more? I'm proud of the record, you know, that we had. We brought more of these cases against police departments than any administration before us. We pushed these consent decrees to make sure that there was, you know, good policing and good community relationships with police officers. And I wonder, though, is there more that we could have done? Because clearly, although I think we made progress, we haven't solved the problem because these things continue to happen. And so I think about that. I think about also our failure to pass sensible gun safety legislation after the massacre at Sandy Hook. That is still something that, you know, I can almost get emotional about, because I saw that classroom, you know, I talked with those first responders, those crime scene search officers. They were crying, I was crying. These little angels had been killed. If the American people had been with me on that tour, we would have been more successful in passing that gun safety legislation. I think about that as a failure from my time as AG.
Are you confident that Democrats, given the opportunity, would not use gerrymandering to their advantage?
You know, I'm confident that that will be the case, but here's the other thing. Here's the pledge that I have made. I will campaign against, raise my voice against any Democrat who uses any power that they obtain. If you know, you have a trifecta, if you have a Republican, if you have a Democratic governor, Democratic control of both houses, and if that power is used to gerrymander for Democrats, I will campaign against those people, and I will certainly be very vocal in pointing out that Democrats are using that power improperly. This is not an effort that I signed up for to make sure to allow Democrats to do that which Republicans have, I think, so inappropriately done.
What is the future of marijuana in regards to the federal government and the law?
I mean, I think, you know, our nation's evolving. We made some controversial, consequential decisions with regard to not trying to go after Colorado and Washington when they made the recreational use of marijuana legal under their state laws. We set up a whole set of factors that we would consider before the federal government would become involved, and I think those made sense in what was called the Cole Memo, named after the then Deputy Attorney General, which I guess has also been rescinded. But our nation's changing when it comes to viewing the use of marijuana, certainly with regard for medicinal purposes, and I think with regard to recreational purposes as well. It needs to be rescheduled. It shouldn't be a Schedule I drug in the federal system. And I think we need to come up with a federal enforcement policy that is consistent with what we know about the science, about the use of marijuana, and then where we are as a society and how we view the use of marijuana, and whether or not we need to use our law enforcement resources to go after people who are using marijuana. I think that what we've seen so far, at least in Colorado, in Washington, really, I think, indicates that the federal government should probably take a more hands-off approach.
And final one, do you think that it's possible to overturn Citizens United?
Ooh, good one to end on.
Yeah, I think that probably requires, there may be some crafty legislation that can be drafted, but I think you're probably looking at a constitutional amendment, but I think it's worth the effort.
Or a different Supreme Court?
Different Supreme Court. You know, another case comes up and they cut back on the Citizens United decision in some way. You look at, you know, Bush v. Gore, Citizens United, the blown opportunity that the Supreme Court had with regard to gerrymandering. There's a trio there of you know, cases that go to kind of the guts of our democracy. And my hope would be that you know, we'll elect a Democratic president who will appoint good justices, and maybe that's a way to get at Citizens United. But I think, you know, if you're going to think about a constitutional amendment, that's a place where I think an effort should be made. That is a disastrous, it's a terrible decision. Citizens United, Shelby County, those are just awful, awful decisions that ought to be appropriately reversed and as quickly as possible.
I propose money is not speech for the constitutional amendment.
Well, see, I think that's right. The Buckley versus Vallejo notion that equated money with speech, which is kind of the foundation for all this, I think was wrongly decided.
Older 1970s.
Yeah, I think that's wrongly decided.
All right, let's end on that note. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.